Hey everybody, welcome to Project Brussels. This is going to be a 3-part video series in which I recreate Brussels, the capital of Belgium and de facto capital of the European Union, in a full-scale recreation, albeit with a not very high level of detail, as you might be able to tell, in city skylines. And in addition to that, I should add, it's also going to be a bit of a vehicle for me to talk about my thoughts on city skylines as a game, its relation to the fields of urban planning and urban studies, and also my personal experiences living and studying in Brussels these past few years, and doing lots of things that are related to serious gaming. Now this might all sound a little bit vague, so let's get into it and I'll explain more along the way. So first off, I get comments all the time about when I am going to play City Skylines again, and it's always felt a bit strange to me because these past years I've never really stopped playing City Skylines. I just stopped making videos of it ever since 2017 or so. But I've been sort of active in the game. At least I participated in the global build-off in 2018 and I attended PDXCon last year. I say last year, but it was really 2019. I just want to forget 2020 existed. Where I met up with lots of other players and asset creators and people from Paradox as well. I just never really made content that I figured would be worth it for my YouTube channel, and Brussels here is an example of that. To be completely honest, I've had this time-lapse file on my hard drive for almost a year. I just never thought it would be worth a video, and I don't know, I'm just very hard on myself sometimes when it comes to putting out content, and this recreation of Brussels is a lot lower in detail than my usual builds and definitely the usual City Skylines builds. And even in the past year, I think the game has come so far, and so many new things have come out that have completely changed things, that this is almost completely outdated, which is part of the reason I've still felt really hesitant to upload this. But I think it's still worth talking about, and I think it's a good backdrop for things that I've wanted to discuss on my YouTube channel for so long. I just never really found a good angle to discuss them with, and at this point I'm just thinking, you know what, I'm just gonna have to throw it into my usual time lapses and just rant about it and see where it goes from there. And also, I'm very curious how you guys' responses will be, honestly, because that's, for me at least, the main reason why I'm publishing this video, is to talk about topics that have been on my mind all this time, and then I would love some more feedback on. Because, to give a bit more of an actual reason why I'm making Brussels specifically and why I've been hiding this from my YouTube channel for a while, the past 2 years I was studying in Brussels. Specifically, I was doing a master's in urban studies from the Free University of Brussels, which was really cool, great experience and a great learning experience as well. It's a 2-year program that's quite broad and interdisciplinary, so it's a bit hard to define, and the courses go anywhere from urban geography and urban social studies to things like urban planning and urban design and mobility planning. So very hard to pin down, but students can choose their own track to some extent in terms of what they do with the program. And it's really interesting because it brings people together from many different corners of academic disciplines. So personally, I was coming from a more sociology background, but with an interest in cities and architecture and the like. But many people also studying there were architects or coming from other kinds of urbanist fields, or maybe even engineers. There weren't any specific engineers, I think, within my class, but we definitely shared classes with them. So really interesting and really cool experience in that sense, especially when you get into group projects. But I'm drifting way off topic. How I eventually ended up with City Skylines was 1 year into the program when we had to start preparing our master's thesis. At the time, I was writing my master's thesis about the Dutch housing policy, which, if you live in the Netherlands and you actually landed a house in the Netherlands, congratulations. The housing shortage is huge over here, and it's a huge issue that's kind of dear to my heart. So I wanted to write my master's thesis about that. And kind of halfway through the process, I realized that it was something that I found very interesting and important, but it was something where I also felt like a fish out of the water, and it was just too complex to tackle in my thesis. So I switched to something that's been on the back of my mind for a few years and I never really dared to tackle, out of a sense that it's a very novel topic and there isn't that much academic literature on it, which is serious gaming, and specifically the use of city skylines in public participation projects. Now, public participation is kind of a broad term, but it refers generally to the process where citizens of whichever city that may be have some kind of say in the development or the governing or policies in their city. And usually this applies to when new projects are developed or certain changes are made to a neighborhood. And the goal is to get the input from citizens, try to give them some power, try to strengthen the processes of democracy and give them some say in their local neighborhood or city, whatever is happening. And I'm saying this very ambiguously because it's quite a broad term and it can refer to many things. But in the context of city skylines, there is quite a bit of academic literature, more than I expected, honestly, about the potential of city simulation games in public participation. And for many years, SimCity has been the main game that academics have targeted in this, and there are many interesting cases of SimCity being used in actual urban planning, not so much in the design phases, but definitely in the participation of the public. And I think, given the fact that City Skylines is a game which goes much further than any of the SimCities have ever gone into realistically recreating city layouts and giving players the ability to customize the game, create mods and import 3D models, there's the potential for many of the same things that made these SimCity public participation processes interesting while going much further than them. So that's why I was really interested in City Skylines in that regard. And it was really cool to see that there's actually a lot of academic literature on this topic, and there are actually some case studies as well. There are a few cases, mostly in Scandinavian countries, where either municipalities have come forward and tried to use City Skylines in some way, or in the case of Norway, even the Prime Minister has played it on national TV, and it's been part of a political cycle. Not to mention, I've been part of one such case study myself in Oslo.crp, or as the making of it was called on my channel, Project Oslo, where students of the Norwegian University of Life Sciences could showcase some of their disciplines in city skylines on a real-life map of Oslo. So, altogether, here I was as a student of urban studies, really wanting to write my thesis about this extremely niche and nerdy topic of city skylines that for a while I was just really afraid of some sort of academic stigma against, writing your thesis about some stupid cultural topic like your favorite cartoon or whatever. That stuff tends to happen a lot, but eventually I figured, I just have to do this, because if anybody is gonna write about this topic, it's probably gonna be me. And I think in earnest, it deserves a lot of attention because City Skylines is quite special as a game. Anyway, I could also kill 2 birds with 1 stone, maybe even 3 birds, you could say. For one, I could add this to my thesis, and it's not going to be the crux in any sense. It's just kind of a way to showcase the game and make it a lot more relevant and interesting for the case of Brussels. But also, I was an intern at the time at Brussels Major Events, which is the city's free event organization. They organize markets and other stuff that happens in the city. And I was there specifically to help make a proposal for a cultural space in the city about games. Eventually, I can already spoil, it didn't go through and City Hall didn't approve of the plans in the end. But it was a really interesting project to be a part of, and I figured this thing in City Skylines could probably be part of it. And of course, the third stone is just that I could do my internship and get university credits while just playing a video game that I already like playing anyway. So, it would be a win anyway for me. So that's very briefly the story of how I ended up studying City Skylines in public participation and why I am making Brussels in the first place. So now I want to say a little bit more about my methods in City Skylines and how I'm approaching this. Honestly, this city is not going to be very detailed, and that was just one of the core reasons why I hesitated to put this on YouTube. It's just not that great of a build if you compare it to other game creations, because some of the most amazing and detailed builds are made in City Skylines, and especially since the game has come out, I think you've seen a gradual shift from large-scale urban planning by some of the main modding YouTubers and players, I would say, to highly detailed, specific, even focusing on certain junctions or procedural objecting your own buildings and stuff like this. So it's kind of shifted in a different direction, and this felt like it wouldn't really fit into that. But anyway, this is a good vehicle to talk about some of these topics that I find interesting. Also, another thing that I should mention is that this recreation of Brussels is never going to be finished. I might as well say it up front here. I know I have a tendency to not be able to finish many of the things that I start, but this one I know by now is not going to be finished because it's just impossible to do it in the game. One of the things that I set out to do with this build is to try and more specifically showcase the technical limitations of the game, because there are just certain limitations that you'll never be able to get over in this game, like the maximum node count, maximum network count. There's a maximum amount of basically everything in this game, and some of the rules you can break, some of the rules you can bend. It's a bit like the Matrix, but nobody's Neo and nobody can completely destroy the thing. So there's the biggest problem that I started running into very soon is the fact that there are not nearly enough network nodes and segments to be able to build every road in Brussels. So I could never build something quite to the scale of the entire city and always have to cut out some of these suburbs and the outer areas of the region. My computer was also a little bit of a technical limitation because my PC is not that good, which on the one hand is good because it means that I can make models that showcase what a decently average computer could actually play and not what a super gaming rig could do. But it also means that I'm pretty limited in what I can do myself. And then there's just the fact that I wanted to just keep this very minimal. The idea was to create a very, very general recreation of Brussels without a specific detail, and then when you wanted to have detail in a specific area, you could always go back to that area, change some of the streets, add detailing, make the buildings more specific. You can actually go down and actually ploppable reco some of the buildings that you want to. But for this general recreation, I wanted to keep it simple. That's not to say I didn't have any methodology. I did, of course, use an overlay, as you can see, which I made from OpenStreetMaps. I also imported a very basic road layout from the importer, although I didn't want to import too many roads because it just creates too many network segments and too many nodes, which of course is problematic with the maximum somewhere around 33,000. And then also, I didn't really know how to exactly zone things because I was going to work with zoning instead of Reco. So the basic format that I'm following is interesting areas on Google Maps become commercial districts and the rest of residential districts become residential. And then for industry and offices, I'm making exceptions per building block and zoning those according to whatever the real life designation is there. So that's the basics of how I come to build this model, and now I just had to apply it to a city of almost 2 million people. Now, you'll have noticed that I cut this video into different chapters. Partly I'm doing that so I'm not speaking the whole time and there's actually a little bit of quiet in there as well, not just my long stream of consciousness. But also, hopefully, that can make it a bit more clear what I'm working on and what topics I'm talking about at the same time. Because this is quite a long video where I'm doing a lot of work that's all very similar and basically looks the same the whole time. Because unlike most City Skylines videos of myself, but probably also of other people, where usually you're just working on one neighborhood or block of buildings at a time, I'm going to be laying down the entire road layout of Brussels, almost the entire road layout of Brussels in just this video. And each chapter is also actually a separate recording on a separate day, as with these videos I'm trying to squish the work of many months of work actually into some very compact small videos. So I hope it makes sense. It's a bit of an experiment for me, but it also helps me be a little bit more clear in what we're talking about and keep a decent set of topics throughout these videos. I want to file back actually a little bit and go back to some of the earlier chapters. The first chapter, I guess, was really about the city center. The second one about the zoning of the city center and actually putting the buildings in place. So here you could see where I am very quickly trying to get lots of buildings into the map without having to plop a ball Rico everything. The third chapter was me working on Sint Gillis, which is a certain neighborhood to the south of the city center, which is really one of the main gentrifying areas in the city right now, and I guess a pretty hip and happening place to be. And right here I'm working on Ixelles Uccle, which is a set of some of the richer municipalities and definitely some of the more quaint and chic neighborhoods in the city that are nonetheless still pretty close to the city center. Although, then again, even within these neighborhoods there's a lot of distinguishable subcultures and neighborhoods. Now, what I just said is probably a good segue to move into the topic of what Brussels is like as a city, because it's very complicated and interesting. Technically, Brussels isn't a city but a region within Belgium, and Belgium itself is a mess. There are many YouTube videos you can watch about this. It has a very complicated organizational structure. There are 7 different governments within the country based on different regions and languages, but something to at least remember in this case is there are 3 regions in Belgium. You have the north, which is Flanders, you have the south, which is Wallonia. Generally in Flanders they speak Dutch or Flemish, which is a dialect of Dutch, as exactly the distinction between which there's a lot of arguments about as well, which I'm not going to be delving into in this video. And in the south in Wallonia they speak French. And between that, sort of in the south of Flanders, but very close to Wallonia as well, is Brussels, which is its own region where people speak both Dutch and French. And supposedly the city is bilingual, but in reality most of the people speak French, and while they do understand basic Dutch, at least much more than the average people in Wallonia, French has sort of become the lingua franca of the city over the years. So there's that interesting organizational structure of the whole country, and within this region of Brussels there is also a city of Brussels, but this is really only the city center and some areas around that. And then most of the city is actually made up of different municipalities, which is not too unique. Many cities in the world used to be made up of different municipalities. It's just that most cities in the world have also started to conglomerate those municipalities and become one major municipality instead. And that's never happened in Brussels for a variety of reasons. One thing that I've heard a lot is the fact that every municipality will have its own mayor that's representative of that municipality to the greater regional council. So people often feel like their mayor is the representation of their neighborhood, and you don't get swallowed by the huge metropolis and its 2 million roundabout inhabitants. So that's an interesting dynamic, I guess, and there are lots of arguments to be made either for actually conglomerating all of these municipalities and making one Brussels city, or leaving it the way it is. Honestly, I'm not even sure at this point which would be better, but the result is that you do have very distinguishable neighborhoods. So right here I'm working on Etterbeek and Auderghem, which are also some of the richer suburb municipalities, and it's the region where my university is located. It's this thing right here, this old military field actually, which is why it has that shape on the left. And let's go into some other stuff that I think is worth talking about. Something which you may have noticed if you've been paying very close attention to the overlay that I'm working on, which, by the way, I know is not the greatest overlay. I ended up going for this OpenStreetMap screenshot because it was the only thing that fit perfectly to the geographical representation of what I use to import the roads and the terrain. But it's not looking so swell, and there will definitely be better overlays in the future. As I am saying this, I am aware of much better ways to do this stuff, but at the time, this was the best I could come up with. But yeah, if you've been paying attention to the overlay, you might have noticed that actually there are words in French and words in Dutch. The reason is that being a bilingual city, everything in Brussels is by law mandated to be available in both of these languages. And obviously this goes for street names and town names, etc. These are all given on Google Maps, well, depending on your language settings, but generally given in both languages. And the same goes for street names on the actual street as well. And there's actually a whole set of laws about advertisements, magazines, public forums, anything which is textual and you might need in the city, which needs to be provided in both languages. I've gotten really interesting booklets where the front is French and the back is Dutch, or vice versa. And when you're in any institution like the local parliament or your city hall or anything like that, you should generally be able to be spoken to in your own native language, whichever that may be. And I may have painted the picture that Brussels is a completely French-speaking city, but it's definitely not. And there are still Dutch or Flemish-speaking, whatever you want to say, people in the city as well. And people who even distinguish themselves very strictly from the Flemish people outside of Brussels in the actual region of Flanders, which makes it all the more interesting. But there's of course another reason why Brussels is a really interesting city as well. So, as most of us Europeans will probably know, and hopefully also people from other parts of the world, but I'm gonna clarify this just in case, Brussels is the de facto capital of the European Union because it's not officially the seat of the European Union, and it also kinda shares that title with Strasbourg in France, which people are always annoyed by because every now and then the parliament has to go to Strasbourg to talk. It's a whole mess, but really, realistically, in reality, Brussels is where the European Union is located. It's where the European Council is, the European Commission, it's where the European Parliament meets, it's where all of the lobbying organizations are located as well. And it's where, for most of the weekday, you can find most of the European politicians, as long as it's not a lockdown situation and they don't have actual physical meetings. So yeah, it's basically the capital of Europe, which is interesting because it never really specifically chose to be the capital of Europe. It just kind of became that over time for a whole bunch of complicated reasons as well. But mostly it's because it just kind of worked out that way. Now, I don't know if this has been a completely positive thing for Brussels as a city, because for better or worse, people like to refer to Brussels as being the European Union in a sense, so that whenever the European Union comes up with new legislature for its member states, people like to say that Brussels has decided something, or some news came out of Brussels, which is all fair, and I definitely don't want to go into my opinion on the European Union. That's a can of worms that shouldn't be opened in a regular City Skylines video, I think. But I do feel like people are misrepresenting the city when they are referring to Brussels as being the European Union, when in reality, most people that live in Brussels have nothing to do with it, and the institutions of the EU are about as far removed from them as they are from anybody else living in any other European city. In a very literal sense, I mean, the European district in the city is kind of its own place with lots of offices and homes of bureaucrats, but not quite as much interchange between that neighborhood and the other neighborhoods of the city. It's almost kind of a bubble, and I think it's experienced that way by both people who work for the European Union and people elsewhere in the city. Of course, there's a lot of interchange from it, and many jobs are generated by it, but the EU does not really represent the city or vice versa. Not to mention that as a political center, Brussels is a lot more than the EU alone. There are also NATO headquarters and a number of other international organizations that make it a political center in general, which I think kind of gets overshadowed by its role as an EU capital, but it's definitely something that's a huge part of the city's identity as well. It's just a very international, globalized political center. Anyway, let's go back to the game and the city at hand, because there are a couple of neighborhoods that I've been working on that I haven't said much about yet. Brussels is basically split into a slightly larger eastern half and a slightly smaller western half by a canal going straight through the middle of the city. Originally, there used to be a river going through the city called the Zenne, which is very similar to the name of the river going through Paris, but spelled slightly different, even if it's in French or Dutch. But anyway, we now have a canal splitting the city, and on the western half we find the municipalities of Molenbeek, Anderlecht and Koekelberg, among others. And what's interesting about this, I guess, is these are historically some of the poorer and more working class neighborhoods, and to this day you find that they have a very mixed zoning with lots of industry dispersed throughout the residential neighborhoods. And supposedly this has something to do actually with their elevation. These are also the lowest lying parts of the city. And so while all of the rich aristocrats historically would be in Uccle and in Oudergem living on the hills, in the forest, in a very nice green environment, all of the factories would be down in the lowest parts of the valley here. And thus, this is also where we find many of the working class neighborhoods. Historically, what's also interesting about cities in general is that working class neighborhoods are usually found underneath the smoke from industrial zones. So very often, depending on whatever the dominant direction of the wind is in a certain area, you'll find the working class neighborhoods just to that direction from the industrial areas. But in Brussels, we just find them around the industry in the middle of these hills, which the city is otherwise lying on. Anyway, it's time to go through to some slightly more chic areas of the western parts of the city. By the way, my apologies if I completely butcher some of these names. Even after living in Brussels, I can't get rid of my Dutchness, and my French still sucks. And then there's the problem of having to choose which language I pronounce some of the names of these municipalities in, and some of them are the same in French and Dutch, and others are just pronounced differently, and others again are spelled completely differently. So, for instance, the French Ixelles becomes Elsene in Dutch, and then Watermael is just Watermael in both languages. Anyway, here we find Jette and Laken, which Laken is a neighborhood around where the royal estate is located. There's a huge park here, most of which is completely inaccessible to the public for most of the year, unless it's spring and people can visit the gardens and the greenhouses on the royal park, and they're absolutely beautiful, really cool. Would recommend, if you're ever around Brussels, to check if the time that you're going there actually lines up with the time that the greenhouses are open, because it's one of the most cool things you can visit there. But yeah, that's what this neighborhood is. Also, according to the statistics, it's one of the parts where Dutch is relatively more prominently spoken than other languages, with the neighborhood with most French speakers being around Ixelles, where you'll also find lots of people who are actually from France, who are quite a significant part of the population of Brussels. Anyway, moving on to some of the last neighborhoods. And so we get to some of the northernmost municipalities within the city, with Schaerbeek, which is relatively well known for Train World, which is its train museum. And if you're into trains, and given that you're watching a City Skylines video, you very well might be, I would highly recommend visiting it if you're ever around Brussels. And also, just to the north of that, we have Evere, which is one of the last municipalities to be added to the city of Brussels in 1954. So a very recent addition, and even to this day, I guess, one of the last parts of the Brussels capital region that you'll see before you enter the region of Flanders. Although then again, once you cross the border, it doesn't really change into a different city, and borders are just kind of, a little bit arbitrary, I guess, and I think this goes especially for Brussels, where the city functionally kind of extends outside of its regional borders. It just happens to be that you go into a different region as far as politics are concerned. And with that, I would like to conclude this video, but not before doing a few plugs. First of all, I've talked about my master's thesis, of course, in this video, and I'm also just going to link it down in the description so you can have a look at it yourself. I would say it's not perfect, and there are definitely things that could be improved about it. I'll very honestly admit that sometimes it was a little bit rushed, and especially during the lockdown situation, it was difficult to make it quite as good as I wanted it to be. But given that I'm talking about it in this video, and that it has a pretty decent overview, I guess, of real-world case studies of City Skylines, as well as interviews with players and asset creators and Paradox Interactive people, I think it's probably an interesting read if you're interested in the topic of City Skylines and serious gaming specifically, and it's probably something that I'm going to refer a bit more to in future videos as well. And honestly, I do want to do more in the topic beyond just this time-lapse of making Brussels, so it's a bit of a taste of what's to come. And of course, if you have any thoughts about City Skylines or urban planning or public participation, please do share it in the comment section, or tweet at me on Twitter, or post it in my Discord. I'll post a link to that in the description as well. Wherever it is, whatever you want to say, I'm interested in hearing all you guys' thoughts about this topic. And yeah, hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I hope to see you again in the next one.